I was a nurse at a small military rehabilitation facility outside Belém for 11 years. The facility wasn't on most maps. It wasn't classified exactly. It was just the kind of place that handled cases the larger hospitals didn't want to manage, and the paperwork was processed through a regional command office that preferred not to draw attention. We took soldiers who had been injured in border operations, civilians extracted from accidents in places the government would rather not discuss, and occasionally, men who had been lost in the interior and found again. The last category was the smallest. In my 11 years, we processed 9 of them. 7 came in alone. 2 came in as a pair. The story I want to tell is about the pair, and about a man named Salgado who arrived a year after them, and about what I learned from watching the night shift do its job for too long. I came to the facility because my mother was sick, and I needed steady work near her. The job was advertised as general intake nursing, 3 12-hour shifts a week, with the option to pick up overnights for additional pay. I took the overnights because I needed the money. The senior nurse who trained me was a woman named Dona Lucia, who had been at the facility since it opened in the early 90s. She was in her 60s when I met her. Small, gray, deliberate in her movements. The kind of person who never raised her voice and never repeated an instruction. On my first overnight, she walked me through the ward. We had 22 beds across 4 corridors, and that night we had 16 patients. She showed me the medication schedule, the call a button system, the location of the crash cart, the procedure for contacting the on-call physician. Then she took me to the end of the 3rd corridor, where 2 beds sat in a single shared room with the door propped open. There were 2 men in the beds. They were both awake, though it was almost 2 in the morning. They were both watching the doorway. Dona Lucia stopped me before we went in. She said very quietly, "These 2 stay together. They do not move to private rooms. The door stays open. The corridor light stays on. If one of them asks you to sit in the room, you sit in the room until another nurse can take over. You do not leave them alone in the dark. Do you understand?" I said I understood. I asked her what their condition was. She said, "Their charts will tell you what you need to know for the medication. The rest is not in the charts." The chart said the 2 men were named Bittencourt and Ferraz. They were both in their early 40s. They had been part of a 6-man survey team that had gone into a stretch of forest in the northwestern part of the state to map an access road for a mining concession. They had been out of contact for 41 days. A search and rescue team had found them on the 43rd day, about 60 kilometers from where they were supposed to be, sitting together at the base of a tree near a stream. They were the only 2 recovered. The other 4 members of the team were officially listed as missing, presumed deceased. The chart noted that Bittencourt and Ferraz had been physically dehydrated and malnourished, but not as badly as expected for the time they had been missing. Both had been treated for minor infections, mild exposure, and what the intake physician had described as acute situational anxiety. That was the medical summary. The rest, as Dona Lucia had said, was not in the charts. I want to describe what I saw, because it is the part I still think about. Bittencourt and Ferraz were polite, cooperative patients. They ate their meals. They took their medication without complaint. They answered direct questions in short, complete sentences. They didn't talk much to each other in front of staff, but I noticed early that when they did, they spoke in a low, even tone that suggested a long-established understanding. They never disagreed with each other. They never had to. What they would not do was be alone. Not just alone in a room, alone in any way that involved separation. If one of them needed a procedure that required leaving the shared room, The other came along and waited in the corridor. If one of them was taken to the bathroom, the other stood at the door. If one of them was asleep when the other woke up, the one who woke up would sit on the edge of his bed and watch the other until he woke too. They didn't request this loudly. They didn't refuse care. They just arranged themselves, quietly and consistently, so that they were never out of each other's sight, and they would not sleep with the light off. We have a setting in the ward for nighttime dim, a low amber light that lets staff move around without waking patients. Standard practice was to switch to dim at 2200 and back to full at 0600. On my third overnight, I dimmed the corridor light at 2200 as usual. By 2230, both men were sitting up in their beds with their eyes open, watching the doorway. Not panicked, not owling out, just watching. When I came in to check on them, Bittencourt said, very politely, "Could you turn the light back up?" I turned it back up. They lay down. Within 20 minutes, they were both asleep. I asked Donna Lucia about it the next night. She said, "We don't dim the corridor on that wing. There's a memo, you'll see it in the binder." I checked the binder at the nurse's station. There was a shift memo from about 3 weeks before I'd started, signed by the head of nursing that read, "Corridor 3 to remain at full illumination during all shifts until further notice. No exceptions. Do not document deviation requests in patient charts. Direct questions to floor supervisor." I read the memo twice. The last sentence was what stayed with me. Do not document deviation requests in patient charts. I had worked in 3 hospitals before this one, and I had never seen a directive that explicitly told nurses not to document something. I asked Donna Lucia, carefully, what the memo meant. She said, "It means we keep the light on. It means we don't write down that we keep the light on, because if we write it down, someone in administration will eventually ask why, and the answer takes longer than the question deserves." I asked what the answer was. She looked at me for a moment. She was good at silences. She used them the way other people used words. After a while, she said, "The answer is that the 2 men in corridor 3 sleep better with the light on. That is the answer we give. If you want a longer answer, you will have to be here longer." I was there longer. I got a longer answer, in pieces, over the next 11 months. The first piece came from an orderly named Renan, who handled the cleaning rotation on the night shift. Renan was in his 30s, talkative in the way people are talkative when they spend a lot of time alone with mops. And he had been at the facility for about 6 years when I started. About 2 months into my time there, we were sitting in the staff break room at 4 in the morning, and he asked me how I was finding corridor 3. I said the patients were quiet. He said, "They're quiet now. They were not quiet the first month." I asked what he meant. He said, "When they first came in, they would not let us close the door at all. Not just open, but with the door fully removed. The maintenance team took the door off the hinges for the first 3 weeks. They would not let any staff member stand behind them. If you walked into the room, you had to walk in a straight line where they could see you. If you came in from the side, they would stand up. Not aggressive, just standing, watching. They would do it until you moved into their line of sight." I asked how they were now. He said better. "They let us close the door now, as long as it isn't latched. They let us walk around the bed. They sleep with the light on. They eat. They do the physical therapy. From the outside, you would say they were recovering." I noticed the way he said from the outside. I asked what he meant from the inside. He thought about that for a while. He said, "I clean corridor 3 at 3 in the morning, every shift I work. I have been doing it for almost a year now. In all of that time, I have never seen either of them fully asleep at the same time. One of them is always awake. Always. Even when both of them look like they are sleeping, if you stand in the doorway and watch for a few minutes, you will see that one of them has his eyes open just enough to see the door. They take turns. They have been taking turns for a year. I asked if they had ever told anyone what had happened in the forest. He said, "Not to me, not to anyone I know about. The intake interviews are in their files, but the files for Corridor 3 are kept in the administrator's office, not in the ward." I had not known that. Every other patient's full file was kept in a locked cabinet at the nurse's station, accessible to any nurse with a key. The Corridor 3 files were elsewhere. I filed that away. The second piece came from a physical therapist named Adriana, who worked with Bittencourt and Ferraz on alternating days. Adriana was practical, in her 40s, the kind of clinician who treated unusual cases as engineering problems. She and I had coffee together once a week at shift change. About 4 months in, I asked her how the therapy was going. She said, "Their physical recovery is essentially complete. They could be discharged tomorrow if discharge were on the table." I asked why it wasn't on the table. She said, "Because they won't go. They have been told they can leave. They have been offered relocation assistance, family contact, the works. They have declined. They want to stay here, in this ward, in this room. They have asked, repeatedly, whether the facility would consider extending their stay indefinitely." I asked if anyone had asked them why. She said, "I asked Bittencourt once." He said, and I am quoting him as exactly as I can remember, "The light here is good. The staff is good. We would like to stay where the light is good." That was the whole answer. I did not push. I asked if she thought they were afraid of something. She said, "I think they are afraid of being somewhere with less light at night. I don't know what the underlying reason is. I have a guess, but I am not going to share it with you. Because guesses become rumors in places like this, and rumors become the way new staff treat patients, and I will not be responsible for that." I respected that. I didn't push her either. The third piece came from Bittencourt himself, about 6 months in. I was doing a routine vitals check around 3 in the morning. Ferraz was asleep, or doing his version of asleep, with his eyes barely closed. Bittencourt was awake, sitting up against his pillow, reading a worn paperback that the facility kept in the patient library. I'd done his blood pressure and was packing up the cuff when he said very quietly, "Nurse." I said yes. He said, "Can I ask you a question? It is a strange question. I am not trying to frighten you." I said he could ask. He said, "When you walk down the corridor at night on the way back to the nurse's station, do you ever feel like there is someone walking behind you? Not a sound, just a feeling. Do you ever feel that?" I told him the truth, which was that I had felt that more than once in that corridor, and that I had assumed it was because the corridor was long and the lighting was uneven. He nodded. He said, "Okay, I am going to tell you something. I am telling you because you have been kind to us and because you should know. When you feel that feeling, you should not turn around. You should keep walking at the same pace. You should not speed up. You should not slow down. You should go to the nurse's station and you should sit down at the desk and you should do something with your hands. Paperwork, coffee, anything. You should not look back down the corridor for at least 10 minutes. Do you understand?" I asked him why. He said, "Because that is what worked for us. I do not know if it will work for you, but it is what worked for us, and I would rather you have the information and not need it than need it and not have it." I asked him, as gently as I could, what had happened in the forest. He looked at Ferraz, who was either asleep or pretending. He looked back at me. He said, "We walked for a long time. We were not alone for most of it. At first we thought we were being followed by another team. Then we thought we were being followed by an animal. By the end, we were not thinking about what it was. We were thinking about how to keep it from coming closer. We learned some things about how to keep it from coming closer. The light was one of those things. Not looking back was one of those things. Staying together, where we could see each other, was the most important one. I asked if he thought it had followed them out. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think something noticed us in there. I think when something notices you for long enough, it learns the shape of your attention. I think after that, even when you leave, the shape is still being looked at. I don't know if that means it followed us out. I think it means it does not need to." He went back to his book. I sat with that for a long time. I did not write it in his chart. The memo had been clear, and I understood the memo better now than I had when I'd first read it. A year into my time at the facility, the third man arrived. His name was Salgado. Salgado had been part of a small logging crew that had been working a concession about 300 kilometers from where Bittencourt and Ferraz had been found. His crew had lost contact for 28 days. A rescue helicopter had spotted him alone in a clearing on day 31, waving a piece of his shirt tied to a stick. The other 4 members of his crew had not been found. He was brought to our facility because the regional command office had a standing order to send certain kinds of recoveries to us. I did not know about the standing order until Dona Lucia mentioned it in passing, the way she mentioned most things, as if I should have already known. Salgado was put in a private room at the end of corridor 3, 2 doors down from Bittencourt and Ferraz. He was different from them in some ways. He talked more. He cried, openly, during his first few days. He asked about his family, repeatedly, and was relieved when we told him they had been contacted and were on their way. He ate well. He slept badly. He was the same as them in the way that mattered. On his second night, he asked for the light to be left on, full brightness, not dim. He apologized for asking. He said he knew it was unusual. He said he would not be able to sleep otherwise. On his third night, he asked if there was a way to have someone sit in the room with him while he slept. He said he understood that staff were busy. He said he would be grateful for any presence, even if the person was just doing paperwork in the chair by the window. On his 4th night, he asked if he could be moved to the shared room with Bittencourt and Ferraz. Dona Lucia was the one who took that request. I watched her from the nurse's station. She listened to him for about a minute. Then she went to Bittencourt and Ferraz's room and spoke with them quietly for a few minutes. Then she came back and told Salgado that the men in the shared room had agreed, and that we would move a 3rd bed in before the end of the shift. We did. Renan and I rolled the 3rd bed down the corridor at about 2 in the morning. We set it up against the far wall, where the light was strongest. Salgado walked down the corridor by himself, in his hospital robe, and got into the bed. Bittencourt and Ferraz were both sitting up, watching the door, when he came in. Neither of them spoke. Salgado nodded to them. They nodded back. Within 10 minutes, all 3 of them were lying down with their eyes either closed or nearly closed, and within 20 minutes, the breathing in the room had settled into something that looked, from the doorway, like sleep. I stood in the doorway for a while after Renan left. The corridor light was on full. The room was bright enough to read in. The 3 men lay in their 3 beds, and as I watched, I noticed that Ferraz's eyes were open just enough to see the door, and that Bittencourt's were closed, and that Salgado's were closed, and I understood that the rotation had simply expanded to include one more person. I went back to the nurse's station and sat at the desk and did paperwork. I did not look back down the corridor for at least 10 minutes. The escalation, if I can call it that, came about 3 weeks after Salgado arrived. It was not loud. It was not violent. Nothing about the facility was ever loud or violent. But it was the night that I understood why the system existed, and why people followed it without asking. A power surge tripped the breaker on Corridor 3 at about 3:40 in the morning. The lights on that wing went out. The main lights on the rest of the facility stayed on, and the emergency lighting in Corridor 3 came on within about 2 seconds, which is what it was designed to do. The emergency lights were dim, amber, low. I was at the nurse's station when it happened. I heard the breaker trip, a soft mechanical click from down the corridor, and I saw the lights on the wing go to amber. I stood up and started walking toward the breaker panel, which was at the far end of Corridor 3, past the shared room. I had taken about 4 steps when I heard a sound from the shared room. Not a scream, not a cry. A long, low exhalation in 3 voices, almost in unison. The kind of sound a person makes when something they have been bracing for finally happens. I stopped walking. I stood in the corridor in the amber light. I could see through the open doorway that all 3 men were sitting up in their beds, fully upright, facing the doorway. They were not looking at me, they were looking past me. At the far end of the corridor, behind me, in the direction of the breaker panel, I want to be honest about what I felt. I felt the thing Bittencourt had asked me about. The feeling of someone behind me. Not a sound, just a feeling. The shape of attention, he had called it. I felt the shape of attention behind me, in the amber corridor, and I felt the 3 men in the room ahead of me feeling it too. I did what Bittencourt had told me to do. I did not turn around. I did not speed up. I walked at the same pace I had been walking. I walked past the shared room, past the 3 men sitting upright in their beds, past Salgado's empty private room, to the breaker panel. I opened the panel. I reset the breaker. The lights on Corridor 3 came back to full brightness. The corridor behind me became, in my peripheral vision, brightly lit and empty. I did not turn around to confirm. I walked back down the corridor at the same pace. I did not look into the shared room as I passed. I went to the nurse's station. I sat down at the desk. I picked up a pen. I filled out a medication reconciliation form that did not need to be filled out for another 4 hours. I did this for what I estimated, later, to be about 15 minutes. I did not look down the corridor. When I finally did look, the 3 men were lying down again. Their breathing, from where I sat, sounded even. Ferraz's eyes were open just enough to see the door. Bittencourt's and Salgado's were closed. I did not write any of this in any chart. In the morning, I told Dona Lucia. She listened. She nodded at the parts that I think she had heard before. When I finished, she said, "You did the right things. You can go home now. Take tomorrow off. I will tell the floor supervisor you're owed it." I asked her if it had happened before. She said, "The breaker trips on that wing about twice a year. Maintenance has looked at it. There is nothing wrong with the breaker. We keep the emergency lights bright enough now that it doesn't matter as much as it used to. We have a memo about the brightness setting. You will see it in the binder." I asked her if she had ever turned around. She looked at me. She was very tired. She had been tired for as long as I had known her, in a way that I had only recently started to understand. She said, "Once, in my 2nd year, I turned around because I thought I heard one of the patients call my name. There was no one in the corridor. The corridor was empty. But I felt, for about a week after that something had taken a measurement of me. That is the only word I have for it. A measurement. I have been more careful since. I have not turned around again. I do not recommend it." I worked at the facility for another 4 years after that night. Bittencourt, Ferraz, and Salgado stayed in the shared room for the entire time I was there. They were joined eventually by a fourth man named Cordero, who had been pulled out of a different stretch of forest after a different disappearance. The four of them rearranged themselves around his arrival the way Bittencourt and Ferraz had rearranged themselves around Salgado, without much discussion, as if it were a thing they already knew how to do. I left when my mother died. There was nothing keeping me in Belém after that, and the overnight shifts had started to wear on me in ways that I did not want to examine too closely. Dona Lucia walked me to the door on my last shift. She thanked me for my work. She told me that if I ever needed a reference, she would write me one. She did not ask me to keep quiet about the facility. She did not need to. I work at a regular hospital now, in a different city, on day shifts. I sleep at night, mostly. My apartment has good lighting in the hallway and in the bedroom, and I do not turn the lights off when I sleep. I tell people I just prefer it that way. Nobody has ever pushed on the answer. There are two things that have stayed with me. The first is that I sometimes feel, walking down the hallway of my apartment building at night, the shape of a tension behind me, not a sound, just a feeling. I do not turn around. I keep walking at the same pace. I go into my apartment. I sit down at the kitchen table. I do something with my hands. I wait at least 10 minutes before I look back at the door. The feeling passes. It always passes. The second is that, about a year after I left, I got a letter at my new address. The letter was from Dona Lucia. It was short. She wrote that Bittencourt had died in his sleep, peacefully, of a heart condition that had been quietly managed for years. She wrote that Ferraz, Salgado, and Cordero had requested permission to attend the small service the facility had held for him. She wrote that the request had been granted, and that the three men had stood together in the chapel at the back of the facility, in full light, for the entire service, and that they had returned to the shared room together afterward without speaking. At the bottom of the letter, in her small, careful handwriting, she had written one more sentence. She wrote, "The room is quieter now, but the rotation has not changed." I read the letter twice. I folded it. I put it in the drawer of my kitchen table, under some other papers. I have not taken it out since. I think about those men sometimes. I think about how they sit up in their beds when the lights flicker. I think about how Ferraz still sleeps with his eyes open just enough to see the door, and how Salgado and Cordero have learned to take their turns in the rotation, and how, even with Bittencourt gone, the three of them have found a way to make the math work. I think about what Bittencourt said about the shape of attention, about being noticed for long enough that the noticing does not stop when you leave. I keep my lights on. I do not turn around in hallways. I do something with my hands when the feeling comes. I do not know if it works. I know that it has worked so far. That is what I have, and that is what I am willing to say.